Thank you for taking the time to watch this short video. This video is an adaptation of a presentation that we did in New Orleans at the Southern Political Science Association conference in January 2014. The title of the conference paper was Nowhere to Go But Left, using narrative theory to resuscitate the moderate Republican. And in the process we wanted to kind of show how we want to reinvent government and how government works. So my name is Lester Leavitt. I'm a doctoral candidate in the School of Public Administration at Florida Atlantic University. What we're going to talk about in this video is trying to support theoretically a new political paradigm of a continuum, because what you see in this video presentation here is down here in the front the idea of traditional government, in the middle the moderate voter who typically decides the elections in the United States is as frustrated as anybody else is with how government is not accomplishing what it needs to be accomplishing at this point in the history of the United States and in the world, for that fact. And so what we're going to try and do is present a theoretical foundation for a new kind of government, a collective government that would form a different kind of moderate middle that has given up on the idea that traditional government can be saved. So that's where we're going to go with this argument here. We're going to take 9 steps in that process. We're going to start by saying I'm going to present the idea that there's a wrong turn, and all of this material has citations, and I've been published in peer-reviewed journals talking about this, and I've supported all of my theory with the work of others. And what I've been finding is that a lot of that work dates back to the 1970s. In the wake of the 1960s and the protests and the upheaval that the United States and the world suffered as a result of the changing values of the 1960s, in the 1970s there were a lot of writings by many academics who were saying that we took a wrong turn. Paramount in that is Ali Farazman. We're going to start with his idea. So point number 1 is, can we go home? We took a wrong turn in the 1970s. We've tried a lot of things, so let's go back to that. That's what Ali Farazman talks about in his work. As you can see here, at the expense of alternative organizational choices and broad-based public interests, we have tried so many things that have not worked. So let's go home. Let's go back to the beginning and start a new idea. And that's what we want to do here. So point number 2 of that is that we have lost of my sequence here. And this is building a foundation under a problem that's very highly compounded over those 3 decades. So point number 2 is the idea that representation for everybody is not working anymore. And the problem with number 3, the problem with homogeneity and hierarchical power. And we're going to discuss that a little bit. Point number 4, we're going to talk about narrative communities, whether they're homogeneous or heterogeneous. Point number 5, we're going to talk about interpretive monopolies and what kind of sustaining institutions preserve these narratives that certain sustaining institutions claim that there is only one way to interpret this, that there's a capital T truth. Now point number 6, we're going to talk about how the mobilization of bias is impacting all of this, and how it protects these interpretive monopolies by fabricating a bias. Point number 7, we're going to talk about religiosity and the one-sided privatization of conflict. This is a fairly complicated term, but I'll cover it off really quickly. Point number 8, we're going to talk about the global elite and how they leverage a worldview threat in order to accomplish their goals. And then point number 9 is, what does a libertarian do? All of these other compounded problems that build one on top of the other and just continue to get more complicated and more wicked, as we call it in academia. So this idea that what's a libertarian to do when there's nowhere left to go but left? And that's where we're going to end this video presentation here. So I've already introduced you to Ali Farazman. He is my dissertation chair, and he has been studying organizational theory, organizational development, and organizational behavior there's about 15 of them throughout the world that are very highly recognized for what they do. And really their ideas have come to the conclusion that, you know what, let's go back and restart a new idea. Let's get a new beginning on this. And where I've identified this wrong turn, I went through as part of my research over my years as a doctoral student, and I kind of built this chart where at the top of the scale we have, well, I used John Rawls, from 1973, A Theory of Justice. And he talks about equality at the top end of my scale here and liberty at the bottom end of my scale here. If you have too much liberty, then the powerful have all of the rules in their favor. If you have too much equality, then people start getting lazy. So the idea is just finding this balance. So John Rawls' equilibrium is this middle solid black arrow going across the decades in the history of the United States. So here in 1968 is where everything kind of seemed like, well, we are really getting close to John Rawls' equilibrium. Then we took a wrong turn. I argue that that was coincidentally timed with the election of Nixon in 1968 and then his landslide victory in 1972. And so for whatever reason, people were very afraid of the changes that were coming, and we took this wrong turn and then we dropped right off the end of the scale. And that's where we found ourselves in 2008 with the financial crisis. So this wrong turn, and what Dr. Frozman's talking about is, let's go back home. Let's read what these authors were writing about when they warned us in 1973. And there's a long list of them up here. And these are just a few that I've touched on, but I found a lot of my writing is supported by these theories that were developed in the 1970s, and so that's where I go back to. So the idea that representation isn't working, above my head here you can see where we're progressing. The idea that representation is no longer working for us is supported by Nate Silver and his 538.com blog. Nate Silver has crunched the numbers from 1992 all the way through 2012, and what we have now, and these are really swing districts, ones that could go one way or another at every election. There's only 35 swing districts left in the United States. So the idea that representation is no longer working can be supported by the fact that 347 districts in the United States are pretty much decided in a primary election. There is really very little chance that somebody of another party is going to be elected. So a Republican is not going to be elected in a district in Massachusetts, and a Democrat is not going to be elected in a district in Utah. And so out of 347 districts, the minorities that live in those 347 districts are living without representation because their dreams and their ambitions for the United States are not being fulfilled because their views are so in stark contrast to who's always going to go in if they have an R behind their name in a Republican state and if they have a D behind their name. The level of involvement has to change now, and so that's what this presentation is going to discuss a little bit about as well, is the idea of getting involved in the primary election so that the person who wins the primary is not in there just because 15% of the electorate voted in a primary, which is pretty much a number that has been generally thrown around, is that if you can get 15% of an electorate to vote in a primary, they can get their candidate through. And as we know here, 347 districts are decided by who gets in the primary. So 15% of the United States in these districts, 15% of these districts are being represented, and the other 85% are not. And the Libertarian plight in the 2012 election can be supported by how only 154 delegates went to the Republican National Convention in support of Ron Paul, who would have been a Libertarian-like candidate in the Republican Party. And the actual Libertarian Party itself only got 1.275 million votes across the entire United States in the 2012 election. So a Libertarian is not being represented, and that's what this is all getting at. So let's look at hierarchy. Now this is an interesting chart. I really only want you to focus on what's in the red box right now. And this is that whole idea that homogeneous policy networks exist fairly readily. And this is very overly generalized, but just for the sake of argument at this point in time, let's argue that homogeneous policy networks exist fairly much on the political right, and heterogeneous policy networks exist on the left. Now what does that mean? We're going to get into this a little more in depth now. So we have to understand meta-narrative communities. The idea of a narrative community, these 9 boxes underneath are just representative of literally thousands of narrative communities in the United States where people could follow, well, let's define what a narrative community is. We've got 12 representative narrative communities down here. Remember, these are the meta-narrative communities up here, the 9 blocks. And so we have real solid, we can call them micro-narrative communities down here. So if you are a gay and lesbian activist, you want to be in the gay and lesbian micro-narrative community. If you're an environmentalist, you want to be in the environmentalist activist community. So everybody finds a home on the political left, but there's lots and lots and lots of homes, lots and lots of narrative communities. So it's very heterogeneous. And so on the other side of the political spectrum over here, you have very few narrative communities because the ones that are there are, number one, homogeneous and very powerful. And let's understand where that power comes from now. But we're going to simplify this a little bit in order to go on. Instead of having all of these narrative communities that you see here, what we're going to have is we're just going to look at the new economy progressives as a narrative community on the left, and the small government libertarians as a narrative community on the right. And everything else we'll just lump into, for now, for sake of simplicity, the religious right and the big government left, because those are pretty much the ones that occupy the polar extremes. So you've got these highly polarized big government left over here, and that highly polarizing force, the religious right, at the far end of the right. Okay, so let's talk about these narrative communities and understand them in granular detail. The idea of a narrative community was something that I borrowed from Mona Baker, where she wrote that a narrative community is a group of people that are held together by their willingness to subscribe to the same or a very similar set of narratives, acknowledging the power of narrative to instigate and to maintain a sense of common identity and its potential as a basis for political action. So they come together, and there is often, in my case here, there will always be a political purpose for getting together and staying together as this narrative community. So let's look at the narrative of women are homemakers. Some people hold on to this as what we can all call it an interpretive monopoly. This is a capital T truth to some people. A woman's place is in the home. And this has been supported through centuries. That we've only recently in the last century recognized that women had the right to vote, that women were not part of a man's property. And so this idea that women are homemakers is supported by a sustaining institution that we can call the culture and tradition. And so as we try and break women out of this narrative, and as women try and break out of this narrative, what they find is that there is a lot of pushback. So a man can be seen as a boss if he's powerful and if he has a high position in a workplace environment. But a woman is often seen as bossy. And so women face these obstacles. So what's causing this narrative that brings this kind of idea forward that women, when they are exerting a position of power, are bossy, but men are just seen as, oh, okay, he's the authority figure, we respect him. Well, what is doing that is this sustaining institution of culture and tradition. So what you have to do is you ask who has a vested interest and who will benefit either by mobilizing bias to either bring change or mobilize bias to prevent change. And so this is how power is exercised in these narrative communities, because there are, when you have an interpretive monopoly, you typically have a hierarchy of power. And not only that, the narrative has been around so long, the mechanisms are almost automatic. Nobody really has to take charge of protecting this narrative, because the narrative protects itself. It's kind of like hegemony when you look at it, that it's institutionalized. And so we have to break these narratives in order to get out of them. So let's look forward and look at the idea of the Protestant work ethic. A lot of issues that we have in the United States are issues with over how to deal with poverty. Poor people are seen in very different ways. There are deserving poor, and then there are deviant poor. So the idea for mobilizing bias is to push this outgroup. This outgroup is a very important function of an interpretive monopoly, is that if you're not abiding by the narrative, if you're going against the narrative, there's mechanisms in place to push you out. And so if you're poor and deserving, which would be a senior citizen or a child, they're poor and deserving. So we will take care of them. But if you're a male or a female, or if you are a single mother of a certain race, then you're just seen as undeserving somehow. And because you're lazy. So there's this narrative. Where does it come from? Well, it comes from, many would argue, Weber argued that it came from the idea from the Protestant work ethic, because if you read his book that was published in 1905 and republished in 1930, he talks about how Protestants built this loophole for themselves so that they could get into heaven rich. The idea that if you work hard, God will reward you, became this narrative that said, you know what, yeah, you can have money and still make it to heaven, because if that money is a product of working hard, then that's a good thing. And so that narrative evolved to the point that, well, people who don't have money aren't trying hard enough. And so even God himself does not like poor, undeserving people because they're just lazy. And so this was this loophole on how to cast people into an outgroup. And so this is what we're going to talk about next, is this mobilization of bias. I love Joan Walsh's book. The title of the book is What's the Matter with White People? And she talks about how there really never was a golden age. It was a fabrication. It was a narrative that everybody bought into because it felt good to have that idea that there was a golden age. But it was only a golden age for a very, very narrow slice of the American population, such a narrow slice that it's arguable that it never really existed except for in people's imagination. And so this idea of what does a narrative mean when they say take our country back? Take our country back to what? Well, Joan Walsh's argument is take it back to a period that never really existed in the first place. It was a storyline, it was a narrative. So we want to go back in the United States to this narrative of what it was like for a white family with a stay-at-home wife in the suburbs. And what about the rest of America? There was so much more to America than this husband, wife, who stayed at home, 2 children, a dog, and a house in the suburbs. But that's what people think of, and that's what the narrative "take our country back" means. But what about everybody else? And so this is this mobilization of bias. And so this is a mechanism of creating that outgroup. If you're not like this, then you are somehow deviant. You aren't working toward proper American ideals. And so this idea of conflict between groups is something that Snyder talks about. He talks very extensively about the privatization versus the socialization of conflict. So if you want to socialize conflict, what happens when you socialize conflict is that you get it out there and people start talking about it, and you can actually mobilize a movement so that change in government will happen as a result of that. The privatization of conflict, on the other hand, happens when you take it off the public stage and you say, you know what, this is not a problem for the public to deal with. This is a problem that they need to deal with. And so if you can put the problem into that deviant, undeserving outgroup, then that's what the privatization of conflict is. And when you put it into Christianity or religion in general, then it's the idea is you've privatized the conflict, because we have in the United States this religious freedom, the freedom of religion to worship as you may. And so if you all of a sudden say, you know what, this conflict has to do with my faith, then you've privatized it for those who are actually against you. But what have you done within the faith? If you are a Christian in the United States, you have this enormous block of the population that is essentially able to socialize socialize that conflict among themselves and get a movement going. But that minority on the other side, who's feeling oppressed by Christianity, especially Christian fundamentalism, then they're all of a sudden saying that they're being told that no, you can't socialize this conflict because I'm protected by the Constitution. But we can socialize it within our Christian community. And so that's how many things are being done here in the United States. That's how things have been codified. And as Martin Luther King said, the most segregated time in the United States is at 11 o'clock on a Sunday morning. So if you have privatized the conflict into a white Christian community and left out the black Christian community, then you start to understand the problems that we have now, is because that racism has been so codified into a religious narrative for white people that even religion is now being used to marginalize blacks, because that code is embedded in it so deep. So this idea of conflict is and I'm going to use a gay narrative. So the Christian community has privatized, or tried to, and only recently been unsuccessful at privatizing the idea of gay rights being a civil right. Because they've said for many years now that Christianity has supported this, and so you can't challenge Christianity's narrative on LGBT, gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender rights. So gender identity had for centuries been privatized, and only recently have we been able to socialize that and say that people are born gay. You know what, they didn't choose to be gay, nobody would choose this onto themselves. And so this idea of people being born gay is a performative view, that you know what, we don't know for sure, the studies are supporting it, but they're not conclusive, it's not science yet. But all you have to do is admit that there are two versions of the truth here. One version of the truth is this interpretive monopoly that gay people are just living a lifestyle, and just as easily they could choose not to live that lifestyle and we wouldn't have any more gays in the world. But the idea that people are born gay is this idea that's gaining some traction, and that's a performative view. So the idea of an ostensive view is like we set the table and we go out of the room. The table is still set, even though nobody is there to see it. The table, when we go back in the room, the table will still be set because it's an ostensive situation where once it's in place, it stays in place. And that's what people want you to think about religious narratives and cultural and traditional narratives about women being homemakers. These are ostensive views. We only have one version of this truth. We're going to stick to that. But the performative view challenges that. That's why you see this yellow arrow in here. That's that threatening element of a performative view against an ostensive view, because that would mean that if people are born gay, that this narrative no longer works. So once you understand this worldview threat, and how that worldview threat comes from the idea that there can be multiple versions of the truth, then you've got an idea of what social constructionism is. And that's very threatening to these sustaining institutions here. So that's what these sustaining institutions do, is they protect themselves against alternative versions of the truth. And the performative view, all it wants to do is just say, you know what, can't we all get along? And that's the idea, and that's the difference now you can see between homogeneous policy networks and heterogeneous policy networks. The homogeneous policy network already has everybody singing from the same songbook, and so they're very, very efficient, is what Sandstrom and Carlson call homogeneous networks, very efficient, because everybody's singing from the same songbook. The performative view, on the other hand, has many, many different versions of the truth. You know, some people may say, well, people are born gay. Others may say, you know what, they're not doing any harm, so what's wrong with just allowing them to have their own lives? And we really don't need to understand why they're gay. It's just their right to live that authentic life which they feel driven to have and enjoy. But that's a challenge, once again, to this worldview threat. But in a performative view, everybody gets along and everybody understands this. So who's hiding behind Christianity? So now we're going to get to the very end of our presentation here. Who's hiding behind the cross? Well, who benefits if nothing changes? So the power of non-decision is something which was written about in 1962 by Bachrach and Marat. They say there's two faces of power. One face of power is the power that gets things changed. And the other face of power is the face that stops things from changing. So the power of non-decision is an important part about this. So Christian fundamentalists don't want anything to change, which is why they became a wonderful ally for the Republican Party, is in the conservative idea of not spending money, of the Protestant work ethic. All of those things kind of fit together. If we just stop change, then the people who have power get to keep power. And it's as simple as that. The people who have power are not going to lose any more power if they stall out any change, because they've already got it now, so why would we want to change anything? So that's what we're looking at here. That's a worldview threat as well. So all they have to do, if we come back to this picture here, and you look at these homogeneous networks, they're very powerful networks, and this is who anywhere in the world, we can call them Republicans here in the United States, but anywhere in the world where you look at a conservative political party, they all want to do one thing, and that is stop change, stall out change. And so the idea of being able to put yourself, if you're an elite, a global elite individual, and you are wanting to block change as well, you can go, and that's why I put them on this dividing line between homogeneous policy networks and heterogeneous policy networks, because they can pick and choose who they get on board with them politically, because they've got money to buy elections. And so this idea that what they need to do here is they just need to figure out, how can we make these people afraid, and what kind of ideas do we have to put forward that make these people very afraid? Because if we make them afraid of change, then they're going to pull out their checkbooks, they're going to give us lots of donations, we can get conservative media involved, and so we have all these talk radio stations, and we have conservative television stations, and we have all of these demagogues out there who are making money hand over fist over fear. So all the way over here we have the tinfoil hat delusionists, is what I call them. They'll write a check for anything. Christian fundamentalists in the white church are all afraid of things changing, so they'll write a check in order to protect their version of the truth. And even the black church, which is over here in the Democrat Party a little bit now because they've got a black president, they're still very conflicted because they also experience that same worldview threat. And so, to a degree, the global elite will even poach on them because that worldview threat works against them as well. So wherever there is a capital T truth, there is a check being ready to be printed out and written and sent in. So what if we have to do to change this political force? Well, if we curve that political spectrum from left to right, and we say, you know what, we've gone already as far as we can to the right, and we've got some really crazy people over there. So the libertarians are saying, you know what, I haven't got a dog in this fight. Why am I supporting these individuals who I have so little in common with other than the fact that I want small government? But they haven't got anywhere else to go, so they've got this uncomfortable relationship. So if they bend the political spectrum a little bit, and we curve it into an arc, then the small government libertarians, if we're moving away, as long as we're moving away from traditional government, the libertarians are going to be okay with that. And so if we curve the arc, if we make an arc and curve the plane back here, who can we have them meet from the political left? Because we have people on the political left who are uncomfortable with big government as well. They know that traditional government is not working for them either. So if they curve and go back a little bit towards the middle, then what we can create is we can create this collective government in the middle, which has a very different view of what government is doing. So if you can get a lot of the government functions that are put together by collectives, communities, people who are willing to work together, then you've got this idea of, well, this isn't really big government because we're all doing this for each other. And so this is that kind of a new economy. And so I call them the pragmatic libertarians. As a case in point of how awkward this relationship is on the political right, I pulled this story here out of the Sun Sentinel. I live in Broward County in South Florida. And the Tea Party founder was very, very aggressive in getting the Tea Party going back in 2010. And so she's now a board member on the Broward Republican Executive Committee. And she's calling the Log Cabin Republicans, which are the fiscally conservative gay community, who are more fiscally conservative, they're more focused on taxes and fiscal conservatism than they are on gay rights. They would like to change the Republican Party from within. So their main goal is about tax reform and small government. And this lady, who is the founder of the Tea Party, forgot, I think, what TEA stands for, because I always understood that TEA stood for taxed enough already. So here she has these very powerful and very rich in Broward County allies, the Log Cabin Republicans, and she's trying to, well, she's calling them a thug organization because in her mind they've come in and they've taken over the Republican executive in Broward County. But what is it exactly she's after? Because if she's really a true Tea Party person, then she should be after fiscal conservative government, which is why the libertarians are very uncomfortable on the far right because of people like this lady, who is really speaking in code when she's talking about the Tea Party principles. And her true motives are showing through. When you look at things through a narrative theory, people get caught in a lie a lot. Because what you get to see is you get to see how they are, even when they really let themselves be seen, you get to see that in her case that she's really not talking about fiscal conservatism. She is talking about Christian fundamentalism, and there's no other way around it. And she wants to keep this very, very small tent. You've heard the what do they call it? The autopsy on the 2012 election, and the Republican powerhouses said, you know what, we need to build a bigger tent. We're not going to win an election if we don't have this big tent. And here this lady is essentially throwing out, or trying to throw out, the most powerful allies that the Tea Party would have in Broward County, for one reason and one reason only, and that's because they want marriage equality. And they have this idea that civil rights can be a big tent. And so this idea that they have to be one certain kind of Republican is very much a big problem when you get way over here to the extreme right. So the most legitimate question to be asked in a democracy, according to Schatzsnyder, is How can people get control of the government? Well, that's really what this is all about. And so I'm just going to quickly summarize at the end of this video, and I'm going to invite my partner in teaching this program at Roe in, Mickey, we'll call him Mickey, to finish this.